In the summer of 1936, the students at the University of Madrid went home for the summer, expecting to come back in the fall to a new and modernized campus that had only been partially opened 2 years previously and was slated to open more completely in the fall of 1936. In July of that summer, of course, the Spanish Civil War broke out, and the university campus became the nucleus of the battle for Madrid. And all of those new buildings each became a fortress taken up by one side or the other in the fight for the capital. In 1943, the campus was finally reopened, so 8 years after that fateful summer. And the opening address for the term was given by the new dictator, Francisco Franco himself. In his opening speech for the new term, 1943, he refers to this dichotomy of Mars and Minerva, which is a central symbol of the regime's new ideology, whereby Mars, the god of war, is memorialized. The battlefields are memorialized, but looking towards the future, towards Minerva, the goddess of wisdom. The pictures you're seeing now are taken from the building of the School of Philosophy and Liberal Arts during the war, looking out over both sides' positions. Now, the signs of the war were left all over the campus despite the rebuilding efforts. And they show up in all kinds of anodyne spaces, like this staircase leading to the School of Architecture, where here we have signs of mortar fire and the shrapnel launched to the other side of the staircase. Or here, for example, in the School of Pharmacology, when the Spanish Civil War ended, that summer of 1939 was when World War II began in the rest of Europe. And so materials were scarce, compounded by Franco's autarchical approach, whereby Spain was to be completely self-reliant. So this campus, which had been more than just a university campus, it was a national symbol of the renewal of Spanish scholarship and sciences, had used all of the newest, most modern materials and was modeled after specifically United States university campuses. So they used very high quality brick as facing for the new reinforced concrete structures. After the war, those fancy bricks were no longer available. And so the crude bricks that were used in the post-war period have preserved the shape of the explosions that destroyed these buildings. There were mortars fired. There was bombing by Nazi and Italian fascist warplanes, shooting. Even in some places where workers tried to fill in bullet holes with cement and follow the shape of the bricks, they still couldn't help but preserve the shape of the bullet hole and the cracks radiating out from it. So these marks of the war are all over the campus. And once you know to look for them, they're quite evident. However, there are no signs, official signs pointing to them, contextualizing them, or explaining them, as the Civil War remains a very contentious issue in Spanish society. So a few years ago, I embarked on a project called Moncloa, which is this area that encompasses the campus. Moncloa as a palimpsest, looking at kind of uncovering these layers. So the project is based around taking rubbings of these marks from the war in the hopes that it would render them more visible by casting them as just black on a white ground without all of the distractions all around. And I wanted to probe the limits of an aesthetics of violence wherein the object of violence speaks for itself. Perse's index, the bullet hole indicating a shot was fired. It was, in a sense, an aesthetics against aestheticization that I wanted to get at, in opposition to the over-aestheticization of war photography, for example, and the complicated empathy that arises from that kind of photography. So I made a lot of these rubbings, exploring this idea of kind of letting the stones speak for themselves. I did activities with students, and I was always surprised, whether doing the activity with students or by myself, when people would come up to me. So many of them had never noticed this fact of their campus before, even though it's everywhere. And many all of a sudden would say, I walk by here every day, I never noticed this. And it was as if a lens had just turned on and they could all of a sudden see. I started to think of these marks as sort of inscriptions in the political plastic to use the terms of forensic architecture, that is the built environment around us. It was, in a sense, an inscription inscribed by history itself in the stone, as opposed to a spin on history inscribed by the victors. But there were a couple of twists and turns in this practice and research. For example, in this space here, where you see these marks from the war that are not indicated in any way other than the way they indicate themselves, there remains a plaque commemorating Franco rebuilding and inaugurating this school, which is the School of Pharmacology that we saw before, that has all the brickwork preserving the shape of the explosions. It specifically commemorates the inauguration of the campus that I alluded to earlier in 1943 on the 12th of October. The 12th of October is the day commemorating when Columbus stumbled into the Americas. No, it's Columbus Day, which in Spain is a national holiday, El Día de la Hispanidad, the day of Hispanic identity, because the campus, even before Franco, was envisioned as a center of pan-Hispanic learning. But the ceremonies on that 12th of October, 1943, were not your typical beginning of term ceremonies. There was a mass, a military parade. The top brass of the army, the generals that had led the troops that had overcome the Republic, all were on display. There was even, connecting with this pan-Hispanic thrust that Franco really pushed a lot, there was even this sort of mock Mexican step pyramid with a giant cross on top of it in the middle of the quad. But to get to the giant Mexican step pyramid in the new rebuilt quad, sure, you could see pockets of things that have been rebuilt, but this picture was taken the same month as these events, and this dotted line here is the path that the people attending the event would have taken from town to the campus. As you can see, they're going past a landscape of total destruction. It's almost a lunar landscape full of trenches, the foundations of buildings that have been razed to the ground. And after the mass and military parade in that quad, everyone marched down to the School of Philosophy and Letters, where those pictures at the beginning of the talk were taken. And to get into the main building where the main speeches were going to take place, including the speech by Franco himself, they had to pass through another inscription which remains on campus today from the Franco regime, which is the names of all of the students of this school who died in the war, but only from the winning side, not the students who died defending the Republic, of course. Now we're going to turn to Franco's speech, and it was a speech that for me was a turning point in the project, because what I discovered was that all those signs of the war that I wanted to point to, and as an index saying, look, this happened here, is a sort of, we're in the scene of the crime, a sort of forensic look at those signs. Franco himself, in his speech on that October 12th, 1949, was already doing something very similar, pointing to the remains of the ruins of the war with a very different value. So as we're going to see, he's going to emphasize here, this is the place, this is the scene, but in his case, it's not the scene of the crime, but the scene of heroic deeds. So you're going to see over the newsreel footage of his speech, a close reading at the end, a sort of epilogue where we rewind and sort of take a skeptical look as maybe what a skeptic in the audience looking at the newsreel might think.
Las armas crearon nuestra España de hoy. Por ello, si pudiera olvidarse aquí, está la realidad inmortal de este campo de Marte, hoy trocado en palacios de Minerva. Todo es reciente, a pesar de la inmensa transformación. Aquí acampó nuestra cruzada victoriosa. Aquí se tremolaron nuestras banderas. Aquí se clavó con tenacidad la avanzada sitiadora. Y aquí se empapó la tierra con la sangre generosa de nuestros caídos. Por entre estos edificios serpenteó la línea de combate y tronaron los cañones y estallaron las minas. Aquí sucumbió la flor del mejor de la juventud, inmolada en el más puro de los sacrificios. Diríase que ha sido prodigiosa su fecundidad. Ellos quedaron sepultados entre las ruinas y hoy las ruinas han desaparecido para servir de cimiento estos colosales edificios que son ahora como monumentos votivos a la gloria de los santos. Sobre el solar heroico que fue su tumba, España ha reconstruido ese vasto recinto consagrado a las letras, con lo que se le tributa el mejor homenaje, con lo que sienta la más esencial de sus afirmaciones espirituales. Porque si esta ciudad fue antes el anhelo de un reinado y la preocupación gloriosa de un monarca, es desde ahora y para siempre memoria perenne de una juventud que salvó con la muerte a su patria y obra de un régimen vindicador del signo espiritual de la civilización y de la vida.
Franco is pointing to the site as the site where this violence happened, but as a positive thing. No, whereas I kind of had naively been thinking we just point to this and people will see it and they'll realize, you know, wow, we're in the scene of the crime. No, but this gets back to what I was saying about the context of the day. There's this huge military presence. There's this field of ruins. Everyone who's there, it's not like today where we're talking about a period of post-memory. Everyone present there that day had lived through the war. It was their actual memory, not post-memory. So there was, whereas pointing out those marks today brings a sense of discordance, a sense of things becoming uncanny all of a sudden, where the familiar becomes strange and violent. In that moment, there was a total continuity, which is what the end of that newsreel footage is getting at. You can't tell which ones are the people marching in the parade at the inauguration and which ones are the soldiers marching into battle, because in a sense, it doesn't matter. They are one and the same. It's one and the same movement. Yesterday, we were fighting with guns. Today, we're fighting with books, but we can go back to the guns if we need to. So the value of remembering for Franco isn't just, it's on the one hand to memorialize, no? The ruins, like we saw in the present day, the foundations literally of these new buildings, which are the same buildings, the foundations are the ruins. The ruins enable this glorious present to unfold before us. No, that's the dual discourse of the regime. But Franco's memorialization or perennial memory also has an obverse. It's a warning against what he calls later in the speech, the aberrations of the subversive center that was the university. So if you might be inclined to rebel, be forewarned. We did this once and we can do it again. There are many students around you, like the ones who fell in battle before, who will rat you out. And the regime's emphasis on this was not unfounded, because the first protests against the regime came in 1956 in the university, and it was a pressure that would increase up until his death, when the university really was sort of the epicenter of the subversion. So this led me in my own practice to question that ability of just pointing to the index and letting it speak for itself. Because in this site, for example, that's on screen now, I heard, I didn't witness this, but I heard that there was another student from the Faculty of Fine Arts who had done a performance where she took other students with her and had them stick their fingers in the bullet holes. It's kind of like a Doubting Thomas moment. And there was a picture of these two fallen men in this spot, and said that this was where a firing squad was. People were shot here by the regime. And that's not what happened. The fallen soldiers were Franco's own troops who had been shot from across a no man's land by Republican soldiers, and the marks on the wall are from that back and forth fighting of the first days of the battle for Madrid. So want to keep in mind that yes, it's good to question the aestheticization of violence, but to be careful of paring things down too far, because they don't speak for themselves. So I did this piece, for example, zooming out and bringing out all the textures that are there in that rubbing, from the planks that were used to build the formwork for that pillar, and thinking about all that had been destroyed in the war too, all that had been made and destroyed, where the bullet hole marks have been covered up several times and that covering had fallen away, the bullet marks, just bringing out all of that sort of history that's there in the texture, zooming out from the act of violence and what was lost with that violence, and how did people try to cover it up at different times. So the final installation had pieces like moved away from those pieces that were just of like the bullet holes that were overtly, you can just say this is clearly a bullet hole, and had more kind of like question marks. Like this piece was a rubbing of these trees, these poplar trees in the area that had these marks that looked like they could be grown out bullet holes. And I did this whole sort of research into, were those trees there? Could they be trees that were wounded in the battle? And it turned out they weren't. But I left it in the project as kind of like a testament to that fact too, that you need to do that research. And in the research, you find other things that you weren't looking for. Or these were manhole covers from before the war that I researched, hypothesizing whether the sewers were used by the soldiers to get around underground during the battle. It included pictures as well and overlaid maps projected on the wall, just to not be afraid to get information and research in there. Because an index, ultimately it says this happened, but it doesn't say who or why or when or how, and that can be filled in untruthfully too. So I just wanted to end with this clip from Blue Velvet, where Jeffrey Beaumont finds the ear in the field, and all of a sudden that ear, that is an index, that someone's ear was cut off by someone, and someone dropped that ear in this field. We have the here, we have the index of violence, but what Jeffrey doesn't have is who, why, when, and how. So I just hope with this kind of work, talking about an aesthetics of violence, I think that I'd like it to push the viewer, the participant, to want to know more and to go on a sort of journey like Jeffrey Beaumont in the movie, to get to the bottom of things, to spark that curiosity that will hopefully move things forward. Thank you.